Fairfield, California. Early morning, October 30th, 2021, just hours after Halloween. The air was chilly, and fog lingered on the small streets. In a well-appointed home near Travis Air Force Base, the curtains were still drawn from the night before. A weak ray of sunlight filtered through the frosted glass, but inside and everything was eerily still. A bedroom smelled of perfume. A Halloween costume was still draped over a chair. A phone fell to the floor, the screen off. On the bed, a young woman lay still, her body devoid of warmth, as if time had stopped the night before. The girl was Leilani Beauchamp, a 19-year-old college student from Carmel. Friends described her as fun-loving, affectionate, and a pleasure to be around. The night before, she had attended a Halloween party with a new friend, a night that should have been harmless. There was no sign of a fight, no broken door, no screams. But on the floor at the edge of the carpet was a small dried blood stain. No one knew when it had appeared. The nightstand drawer was ajar, a gun inside. No one in the house had admitted to owning it. The party had all gone. All that remained was cold testimony and a series of details that didn't match. The story was an accident, but the room said otherwise. The location of the blood, the body position, the unknown gun. Something was wrong, and it wasn't the scene, it was the story. If it was all accidental, why didn't the testimony match the blood on the floor? On the night of October 29th, 2021, a Halloween party was held at an apartment not far from Travis Air Force Base. Lights flickered from the backyard, music played, and the laughter of young people was loud. Among them was a 19-year-old girl named Leilani. Bright costumes, bright smiles, and a group of new friends. As the night wore on, the party fizzled out. Some guests left, others went on to other dates. Leilani was last seen leaving the house with two men in military uniform, one of whom was the owner of the apartment in Fairfield. They were not close friends, but they seemed to have talked long enough to gain trust. At the new apartment, the lights were still on. Leilani went inside, took off her costume, and by all accounts, everything seemed normal. There were no quarrels, no strange noises, and the neighbors next door heard nothing unusual. But it was that silence, in what should have been a cozy space after a party, that made everything that followed difficult to explain. By dawn, only a few people were left in the house. Those who were there said they had fallen asleep from exhaustion. No one knew exactly when things had gone wrong, but one thing was certain. By the time the sun came up, Leilani was no longer alive. Those present gave inconsistent explanations. One said she had fallen asleep alone in her room. Another said she had been awake when they had gone to bed. A third, while not admitting to witnessing anything specific, mentioned a crash-like sound around 6 a.m. No one pressed that. No one elaborated. While the testimonies flowed lightly, the scene held every detail. A chair tipped over, a faint scratch on the wall, a pillow out of place. Small details seemingly accidental, but not consistent with any of the accounts. And then, something strange happened. An uninvited guest, not on the guest list, not known to any of Leilani's friends. But a neighbor's security camera captured the person's appearance around dawn, just minutes before life in the room ended. No one spoke. No one said why. But that unexpected appearance, in the middle of a quiet morning, was like the first piece of a tragedy that had begun long before. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, the house in Fairfield was strangely quiet. One of the people who had been there the night before was a young man in military uniform who walked out of the room with a tense expression. He slowly walked toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, where Leilani should still be sleeping. The door opened slightly. Inside, Leilani lay motionless on the bed. Her face was unbelievably calm, as if she were just sleeping. But something was wrong. Her skin had begun to change color. The air in the room was thick. The young man stepped back, his hands shaking, then quickly turned and ran outside. Not long after, the emergency call was made. A man's voice came over the central phone. "I think someone's dead in the house. A girl. She's unresponsive." There was no panic, no crying. The voice, decisive even, left an eerie impression on the operator. Less than 10 minutes later, the police car arrived. Firefighters and paramedics were on the scene immediately. They entered the house without breaking the lock. The door was open, the living room undisturbed. Everything seemed to be in its place. As the investigation team approached the back room, the scene was clear. A female body lying neatly, no sign of struggle. However, the anomaly began to emerge when the forensic officer bent down next to the bed. There was a faint blood stain on the carpet and next to the open drawer, a bruise clearly visible on the bedpost. A police officer quietly took notes, his eyes lingering on a detail. There was no sign of disorder in the room, but a high-heeled shoe was left in the middle of the walkway, as if someone had left in a hurry. There was no victim's phone, no wallet, no sign that anyone had called an ambulance immediately after the incident. While the investigation team was trying to reconstruct the young woman's final hours, the original caller remained at the scene, cooperating with the police. He appeared calm, recounting every step, every detail, as if he were just an unrelated witness. But then a police officer noticed a slight discrepancy in his story. The time he said he last saw the victim, completely inconsistent with the time of death estimated by the medical examiner. That small detail, initially overlooked, ended up being the first turning point of the entire investigation, because the caller that day was not telling the whole truth. When the forensic staff entered the room, they kept absolutely silent. No one spoke, but all eyes were fixed on the body lying still on the bed. The girl, Leilani, was found motionless, her arms at her sides, her head resting on a deeply sunken pillow. There was no sign of struggle, no blood was flowing, but the silence made everyone more alert. The preliminary examination noted signs of mild internal injuries to the chest, a faint purple bruise on the right wrist, and, most notably, a wound to the lower back. The forensic staff immediately raised suspicions. The victim was right-handed, but the hematoma was concentrated in the opposite direction of the normal defensive reflex. In addition, there was a layer of mild detergent on the skin, as if someone had tried to clean the body. The floor was examined under ultraviolet light. In the dim purple light, the long streaks were clearly visible. A faint trail of blood led from the bedside to the door, where it was blocked by a small gray shag rug. When the technicians lifted the rug slightly, they found a dried blood stain underneath, deep, seeping into the floorboards. The facts began to fall apart. The first person to discover the body said he had not touched the body, had not moved the furniture. But how could there be blood under the rug when the floor around it was clean, as if it had just been mopped? The laundry room at the back of the house added another layer of mystery. A white towel, still damp, lay in the trash, stained reddish-brown. Nearby, a pair of latex gloves had been turned inside out. All of this suggested something no one wanted to believe, that the scene had been tampered with after the fact. Why had the body been mopped, but there was still blood under the carpet? That question haunted the investigators throughout the first hours, because it was not just a strange detail, but could be the key to unlocking the whole truth hidden in the dark. Immediately after the preliminary examination was completed, the investigation team was ordered to stay at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no eyewitnesses, and no widespread bloodstains. But every little detail was opening up a chain of big questions. Leilani had not died in an accident. That was the first thing the police confirmed. A list of people who had been at the party that night was quickly compiled. Of these, 3 names stood out: the host, a soldier serving at Travis, a friend who had accompanied him, and a guest who had unexpectedly appeared the next morning, captured on a neighbor's security camera. The investigators began to reconstruct the timeline. From the time Leilani left the main party to her arrival at the apartment in Fairfield. It was not far, only a 20-minute drive. Neighbors reported hearing a slight noise around 6 a.m. Not a gunshot, but something like someone dropping something heavy. But the route map from the victim's phone showed the last signal stopping at 5:41 a.m. The police decided to call them in one by one. The friend who was with them, a thin, light-skinned young man, was cooperative. He said he had slept on the sofa, heard nothing, and woke up only when the homeowner woke him up after finding Leilani unresponsive. He was allowed to leave after a few hours of questioning. The focus shifted to the homeowner. He was the last person seen with the victim and the one who called the police. His name was Juan. Calm, deep-voiced, polite. But there was something in his eyes that made the investigators hesitate. Juan's account was clear. He said Leilani was too tired to sleep. They just lay next to each other. He fell asleep, then woke up in the morning and found her motionless. The story sounded plausible, but it didn't add up. Leilani's phone records showed the last texting app was opened at 5:18 a.m. Juan, meanwhile, said he woke up around 6 a.m. and hadn't heard anything. A few hours later, the forensics team announced the estimated time of death, 5:30 a.m. The difference was only a few minutes, but in a crime, it was a whole new window. The investigators returned to question Juan a second time. This time, they used psychological baiting tactics. "Are you sure no one else came to the house that morning?" Juan shook his head. A minute later, the police showed a photo from a neighbor's surveillance camera. A black SUV pulled up in front of his house at 5:27 a.m. Juan's eyes changed. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "That's my old friend. She came because she left something behind last time." The police asked, "Who is she?" Juan replied, "Jessica. She only came for a few minutes and then left." At this point, the name Jessica officially appeared in the case file. No one thought she was involved, even less that she had ever had a relationship with Juan. But in the background investigation, a prominent detail appeared. Jessica was dating the victim's younger brother. The police decided to call her in to clarify. Jessica walked into the interrogation room with a calm face, light makeup, and the opening statement. "I heard that Leilani had an accident. I was shocked too." But her eyes did not meet anyone in the room. The investigator let her speak first without interrupting. Jessica said that she had just stopped by to get her coat, and when she saw that everyone was still asleep, she left. At this point, an investigator pulled out a photo of the bloodstain on the carpet from the file. They said nothing, just placed the photo on the table. Jessica glanced at it for a second, then she lowered her head. No one pressed, but they knew something was afoot. The second hour passed. A police officer asked gently, "Do you know where Leilani was in the room when you arrived?" Jessica raised her head. "I didn't go into the bedroom." The answer raised eyebrows. Juan's testimony, meanwhile, said otherwise. "She did go in, but only for a few minutes." This contradiction was noted, but what puzzled the police even more was the unusual agreement between Juan and Jessica. Both of them tried to minimize each other's role, as if they were covering up something bigger. And then the first twist appeared. After seizing the neighbor's car's dash cam, the technical team extracted a blurry image, but enough to see a figure entering the house, carrying something that looked like a handbag. A few minutes later, this person came out, but not with one hand, but with two hands, dragging something heavy. Then the black SUV left. At first, the police thought the person in the photo was Juan, but when analyzing the gait, height, and shoe model, all matched Jessica. The person the police first suspected, Juan, was actually a witness who was manipulated. He was present, knew about the incident, but was not the perpetrator. And Jessica, who seemed to be just the victim's brother's girlfriend, was the central link. When she was called in for a second interrogation, Jessica was silent for a while longer. No denial, no confirmation. But the coldness in her eyes gradually disappeared. It was then that one of the investigators said quietly, "We know who fired the shots, but what we want to know is why." That question did not require an immediate answer, but it marked a complete change in the direction of the investigation. An unexpected turn, the first suspect was completely innocent. The Solano County courtroom was packed the morning the trial began. Reporters crowded in with the victim's family, and the back row was filled with friends of the defendant. The tension was palpable, though no one had said a word. Jessica Quintanilla walked in wearing a beige prison jumpsuit, her hands cuffed to her waist. She didn't turn her head, didn't look for any familiar eyes on the stand. Her face was as cold as a sheet of paper. That gaze had remained the same throughout the trial, except for a brief moment when images of Leilani's body were shown. The prosecutor opened with a sharp argument. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act, done in a fit of jealousy and anger. But emotions are not an excuse to avoid the consequences. The defense countered, "There is no direct evidence that she pulled the trigger. It could have been a reflexive act of self-defense, or it could have been a sudden collision." But then a new witness was called. The man was not on the original list. He was a unit mate of Juan's, and he had heard, the day after the incident, that Juan was afraid of Jessica because she came with a gun and threatened everyone if she told the truth. The moment the witness said that, the room fell silent. Jessica raised her head and looked straight at the man, her eyes changing for the first time. The prosecution seized the opportunity. They presented the entire chain of evidence, from the blood on the carpet, the bleach on the body, to the time Jessica's car arrived at the exact time the coroner determined she had died. When she was called to the stand to address the jury, Jessica, after days of silence, suddenly changed her testimony. She admitted that she had entered the room, had seen Leilani, and had brought the gun just to threaten. But she said it had all happened faster than she thought. The belated admission did not save her from the conclusion. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: first-degree murder. The verdict: 25 years to life in prison. Her brother Marco, who had helped hide the body and destroy evidence, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for accessory after the fact. Outside the courthouse, Leilani's family hugged each other in tears. A reporter asked the victim's grandmother how she felt. She did not answer, but placed her hand on her heart and said softly, "My grandson deserves to rest in peace." The community reacted strongly. Many expressed their grief that the killer not only knew the victim, but had also entered her own family as a relative. Questions about trust, affection, and the limits of emotion once again were put on the public scale. The case is closed, but its echoes still resonate in the hearts of those who remain. A 19-year-old girl, beautiful, intelligent, and full of ambition, left without saying goodbye, just because of jealousy hidden behind a seemingly familiar face. The family lost a child, a sister, a niece, unfinished dreams, meals without a person, and photos that have not yet been printed have become lifelong regrets. But that pain does not stop at the bloodline. It spreads to the question of trust, that sometimes the people we think are closest can be the ones who bring unexpected danger. Jessica is not a stranger. She entered the Leilani family as a relative, as a part of everyday life. And then from that very close place, tragedy struck. We live in a world where uncontrolled emotions can become dangerous weapons. Jealousy, if not recognized and handled properly, can destroy even relationships that were built on love. The law can give a verdict, but only the morality and sobriety of each person can prevent similar incidents from happening again. And then the final question quietly rings out. If it were you, would you trust the person you love?